trip on the same ship. So we must push one common intention. It's for a better life in the region. For we women and we children. That must be the ambition of the Caribbean and the Caribbean and the Caribbean.
And a very good evening to you and welcome to yet another edition of Politics 101. Tonight's program is going to be our podcast version, Open Word, the Open Word podcast with Professor Clive Thomas. And on tonight's program, we are going to be dealing with that Petroleum Activities Bill that was passed in the National Assembly a week ago. I think it was passed on August 11. And we are going to delve into that with Professor Thomas. Of course, the opposition was the opposition in Parliament, the parliamentary opposition, was critical of the bill. They felt that it gave too much powers to the minister. But there are other aspects of the bill we're going to delve into. I would like to welcome all of you, wherever you're joining us from, whether you're joining us from inside of Guyana, or you're joining us from in the wider Caribbean, or in North America. Good evening to you. Welcome to Politics 101, our edition, our open word edition, in which we deal with the economy, all things economics. Some of you said it's economics 101. Lots of activity and lots of discussion around oil and gas as sections of the society are up in the ante as far as distribution of the resources are concerned. You know, there is the part of the discourse that emphasizes the contract. And you all know that the narrative there is that the contract is a bad contract and it should be renegotiated. And lots of people are emphasizing. And then there's the conversation around the environment, that we run the risk of environmental disaster. And some have argued that it's not even worth it. Taking the oil out of the ground, the risk is so much, and there is that conversation there. And then there is the distributive aspect, that is acknowledging that the bill, that the contract is not such a perfect contract, acknowledging that there's always environmental risk, but saying that in addition to that, the possibilities for moving Guyana to a next stage, in particular dealing with chronic issues such as poverty, that should be put into the mix. So there are the various aspects of the debate around oil. And then in this Emancipation Month, the African Guyanese community has been talking up the distribution of the resources, making the linkage between the unpaid labor of Africans during the period of slavery and the fact that the successor state of the slave and colonial state should hold some responsibility in providing reparations, some form of reparations. Some of them argue that the current state should apologize to African Guyanese. And then I raised the question, not from the standpoint of an economist, but as a layperson. I raised the question of the auctions that are coming up, and we're going to be talking about some of that today with Professor Thomas. I raised the question of the possibility of setting aside maybe 1 or 2 blocks for African Guyanese, and setting aside, there are 14 blocks, And given the fact that none of the previous blocks is owned by African Guyanese, African Guyanese doesn't own the other blocks. I think Portuguese Guyanese and East Indian Guyanese have interest in the other blocks. And I have raised the point of correcting that perhaps we could set aside one or two of the blocks, the 14 blocks coming up, and have African Guyanese business people bid for those two blocks. It's of course it's coming from way out left field. It upsets the notion of the market and all of that, but I thought I should put that in the mix as one way of correcting the imbalance in the oil and gas sector, the ethnic imbalance, which is also part of the discourse. So there's a big discourse or several discourses around oil, and so it should be. There should not be any one discourse on the question of our oil and gas. And we remember about a year or two ago, well, just over a year ago, the IRI had done a poll, and it showed low interest among the people of Guyana, low interest in the oil and gas sector. And some of us had said that that may not be as definitive as it sounds, because people express interest in many ways. And I think that there is no definitive interest in the oil and gas sector. It may not be an interest that is direct. Like I said, African Guyanese interest in the oil and gas is, as far as the distribution is concerned, the ethnic distribution, reparations, from the standpoint of working class people, or people from the working classes, because it's so difficult to talk about the working class today in a place like Ghana. The working classes, poor people, they may come to it from the Buxton proposal, which is quite popular among the lower classes in our society. And they come at oil and gas, I would imagine, from what's in it for the poor. And then others, business people, come at it from the standpoint of business. So the discussion, I think, is quite healthy. One of the things I said at Buxton is that I don't have a problem with local content, but what about an African content? I was speaking specifically to an African audience. What about an African content? What about a class content, a social class content? What about a gender content? You see? So that we are broadening the discourse beyond the textbook definitions of these things and try to apply them to the lived realities of our society. But we're going to talk about some of these things with Professor Clive Thomas. We are going to use the Petroleum Activities Bill as our jumping off point, because the bill has been passed, is now law. Well, I don't know if the president has assented to it yet, but obviously he would. And once he assents to it, it becomes the law of the land. And that law would guide the industry, at least from the standpoint of the state. So welcome to all of you who are joining us tonight. Hope we're going to have the kind of discussion that is going to bring to bear on what's going on, information, analysis, and ultimately education. So let's welcome Professor Clive Thomas. Professor Thomas, good evening.
Good evening, David.
I remember when the IRI in their poll came out with that finding that there was low popular interest in the oil and gas. You were a little bit skeptical.
Very skeptical.
Yes, talk to us about that.
Well, part of the reason why I was skeptical is because I had been expecting the finds and or discoveries in oil and gas to be far more momentous than what it was originally. Remember, the original estimate was just around 601 million barrels, less than a billion. I was projecting then at least 10 to 11 billion barrels of oil. And I was almost laughed out of court for having that suggestion. I tried to provide reasons why I thought that was accurate. And those reasons are sustained, and now I have upped my projection to 24 to 25 billion barrels of oil as the potential for the areas that we now have on auction, or we are intending to have an auction. The government itself has, in its circular notification to bidders, estimated 24 billion barrels of oil. What is surprising to me is that ExxonMobil still continues to suggest that it only has 11 billion barrels of oil as provable resources, while other firms are coming closer to what I have recommended or estimated, and they gave the basis for that, as well as the government's own estimated 24 billion. They have not made any attempt to adjust that. And I think they are deliberately maintaining a conservative view of the oil and gas potential of that area, so as to minimize the bids, so they don't get out-competed or have to pay a higher price than they need to pay to get more access to oil if they were to participate in the auction. But we should remember that the public auctioning is only one part of the story. Alongside the auctioning, the government will still continue to hand out, and I shouldn't say hand out, to negotiate deals with other partners. And they've indicated that, even indicated some countries, the Middle East, India, that they might even get into dealings with in regards to oil. I think the Dominican Republic has now come up as a potential negotiating country with them, insofar as they're talking about a petroleum refinery for about 50,000 barrels per day, alongside a joint venture arrangement with the Dominican Republic. So the issue of the oil block potential is still an issue that is not settled in the media. They still continue to be reported, but more and more the evidence is accumulating that the suggestion of ExxonMobil that we only have around 11 plus billion barrels of oil has been overtaken by the confidence other business sector persons are showing, and other academic and similar resources showing, that the potential of this basin must be more than that, far more than that, double that at least, I think.
Double more than that. And Professor, are you satisfied that your skepticism about the findings of the IRI poll, are you satisfied given what you have been seeing in the media and observing in the wider society, that public interest in the oil and gas sector is moving apace?
Yes, I am. I mean, no country in the world can have a 65% annual growth of real GDP and still be considered not to be on an unprecedented scale or rate of development that the people in the country do not notice. So the reality is reflected in the facts and the data generated by our economic agencies that put out these data. So people are becoming increasingly aware of what is happening. We're now producing more than 500 million barrels of oil per day and exporting it. So that is far different from producing zero. But some countries can't even produce that, who are exporters. And we know that we are in the initial phases of this development. But my perspective is guided by two fundamental principles. which I'm hoping to persuade the WPA to accept. One is that our overriding development model should be the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. All of us participated. I even participated in helping to formulate those goals. Almost every country in the world participated, and we signed on to them voluntarily in 2015. They are expected to come to an end, this phase of the development, in 2030. I'm sure in the years to come, there will be efforts to extend it onwards. But that Sustainable Development Program is based on accepting the continuity for oil. Many people don't know it. We agreed in 2015 to a program of development that incorporated the continued production and sale of oil as an important contributor to the Sustainable Development Goals. We're not doing this out of selfishness. We're doing this because it was an agreed international program, and the United Nations, in its own wisdom, has moved a position because they've been able to mobilize all the exports around the world, where we have until 2050, the early 2050s, as the window of opportunity for oil to still continue to be produced and exported and to play a primary role in the supply of energy in the world. It is not until the early 2050s that renewable forms of energy they project will be able to replace oil and gas. Now, with that type of horizon, we have to be, as a small country in a big world, we have to be realistic. To say that you can buck all those trends, those global trends, and make Guyana perform better than the United Nations itself has come to agree that we can perform. And to stop producing oil now is madness of the greatest and highest order. Because what it does is to relegate a significant portion of our population to persistent and extreme poverty. And that is what we have to try to avoid. This is not a game for middle class people to be playing in. This is real life and death of Guyanese, and that is why I take the very strong position that if we work within the framework of the United Nations, that we don't have to argue anything. The case is made there for us. You just have to read it, and we know how easy people are to forget what they agreed to. We agreed to this 2015, we halfway through the program, and already people don't know we're in the program. People are surprised when I mention to them that we are permitted under the United Nations agreement, a solemn agreement with over 190 countries. In 2015, all signed, all the prime ministers went up, that we have a window of opportunity until the 2050s. That's why we use it. And that's what we have to work with if we are serious about meeting the needs of our people. And if we are serious about meeting our international commitments. Because within that window, we have an opportunity to also fulfill the sustainable elements of the program that they're demanding for people who are in oil and gas. They're calling for many, many reforms to make sure that the oil and gas that they continue to produce is of a type that you can say is not harming the environment in an extreme way. And we didn't decide that to be so we can say we are selfish. This is a UN-imposed regulations. There's 17 development goals, and at least 4 or 5 of them touching oil and gas. And we can satisfy every one of them, and that should be our ambition. That should be our practical ambition if you're serious and you're not after some other personal vanity. That is the goal that I see that we should be struggling to achieve.
Professor
And in that context, that I therefore evaluate all that has been happening and what that we should be doing to make sure that we remain faithful to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. We don't have to take on the burden of saying we are going left field and creating an economic program that is particular to ourselves. It's not a Thomas goal. It's not a Heinz goal. These are goals that we subscribe to the nation, and nobody's ever spoken out against it. Not a single voice in Guyana has ever rejected the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Everybody, when they speak about it, speak commendably. They've never once been a public criticism of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And the governments continue every year to pay lip service to it because they publish a report, as they have to, on what is happening. So we need to integrate these commitments we make into actual policy and to found it in a way in which nobody can challenge us to say that we are anything less than a nation committed to servicing all international agreements that we are party of, are a member of at every level.
I note you said just now that the government or governments pay lip service to these sustainable goals from the UN. Are you saying that the governments have not, well, some of the governments have not embraced the UN goals in a structural way?
No, I have not been able to do that evaluation. But what I can say is that when I read some of the reports, particularly from Guyana, I am not impressed that they are serious, publications responsive to the commitments that we gave. They're hodgepodges. I would expect in them to see a detailed tracking of the movement of poverty in Guyana, for example, because that's the primary goal. So we are choosing poverty not because we think the poor people are the most deserving, because the world thinks so. And the UN has agreed in a program to commit the world, and the world has committed itself to recognizing that as a priority. But we can write a whole program of how the goals are being met in Guyana and never give any figure on poverty. It's because I'm writing an article in it that I'm really aware of this right now. We don't give no figures. They look hard. You got to look for the figures in the World Bank and these other places. We make no effort whatsoever to update the figures as we are bound to and we are committed to. But yet we get a lengthy report, at least a couple of 100 pages. And it looks like they fill in with things that are sort of exotic, but still are really relevant to development.
So,
but not a structured, coherent, rational program response that you would expect from a government.
So our government has a lot to do to in a real policy, from a real policy standpoint, to bring ourselves in line with the UN goals, you say.
Yeah, and the budget should be framed in that context. We don't do it, we treat it as if, it's something we sign on to 2015. So it don't matter now. And this is really ridiculous because, I put a lot of my life into that, helping to create that report, as everybody else did who were working on it. And the reports have 17 goals, nearly 200 indicators that you're supposed to be mapping as you go along, every country, every year, every day almost, you have to keep on top of the figures. But we submit reports that are real hodgepodges. They're not serious reports. Probably never read one. And you are a very thoughtful citizen. Much less so the ordinary citizen. You don't even know when it's published.
That's right. You're correct about that. You're correct about that. Professor Thomas, let's pivot because I think that was a good entree to the bill that was just passed.
Yeah.
The Petroleum Activities Bill that was passed in the National Assembly. What is your initial reaction to that bill? The strengths, the weaknesses. Let's start first of all with the strengths of the bill.
Well, I prefer to start by having us recognize, and the public listening to us,
okay,
that under the undergirding the industry, had been a Petroleum Exploration and Development and Production Act that was passed in 1986. That's nearly 4 decades ago. 86, 14, and
That's
20.
37 years ago.
Yeah, nearly 40 years ago, nearly 4 decades ago. So it needed updating. There's no doubt about that. It is an obsolete act, and it's assumed that production will be taking place on the territory of Guyana. It didn't even anticipate the rapid development of our offshore sector. So the act was not catering to the needs of the type of industry that we have been able to develop or to allow to be developed in Guyana since December 2019. So the bill definitely needed changing. The act needed changing. That is the bill until it's passed right now. And the bill needed changing. The act needed changing. And the new bill tries to address the new changes. So it introduces things that the old bill did not have. The old act did not have, and which we need to recognize. It deals much more with issues of storage, which is necessary if you're going to have the oil produced offshore, stored and then exported once a month or twice a month at most. So that's why we have these FPSOs, which are floating production storage thing up underneath the thing at sea, because that's where we produce from. So they have to recognize all these developments, try to make it an act that address all these issues. You also have the issues of security of a environmental type, security of a life-threatening type by terrorists and things like that. So we have to adapt the act to meet some of those circumstances, which we know have affected all industries around the world. You also have to meet the act. We have to have the act address issues of transportation, the movement. Because we're moving the oil now not by cars and trucks and so forth. We move it largely by pipelines, so we have to address those issues. We want to change the way in which we give out contracts. We want to do a lot more public auctioning because we feel that is more transparent. Although, as I've been writing and you've been reading, this turns out to be an iffy question as to whether you really do benefit from public auctions in the way it is so commonly assumed in Guyana. Because all the studies that I have done have shown, I've read, have shown that oil block auctions are not a panacea. They could be an improvement and should be an improvement, but the record does not stand the test of critical evaluation of the use of these techniques in other countries. They look large at developing countries in India, where I've reported on in those reports for citing earlier. So we have the act addresses the issues of oil block auctions. It addresses a whole range of similar type of issues that were not prevalent at the time when this act was originally passed in 1986. So it was from that point of view an update. But it had many limitations still. Because when you pass an act so long after, you have to engage in best practice. You have to meet some of the newer expectations, the newer currency which is operating within the international community. And here you find a lot of other issues that are very tangentially treated. And danger is, in my mind, the single biggest danger is that it leaves most of the reserve powers and discretion to the ministers rather than the technical people. And that is, to my mind, a great potential source for serious error. Because if you minimize the role of professional competence, of professional oversight, and if you allow too much discretion in the hands of persons who have interests wider than wider than the industry that is supposed to be a minister responsible for, you run clear dangers. This happens in every country where this sort of thing has happened. And so I think the bill, while an improvement, will be continuously evaluated, and we have to expect will be continuously improved. I'm not sure that the government has addressed all the considerations that have been raised before, either in Parliament or elsewhere, because the consultation period has been very compressed. The government is very anxious to get on with the auctions, and the completion of this act was a necessary precondition for moving on with the auctions. As you know, they were trying to postpone. So they're in the eagerness to get on with it. I think there might be a little bit of rush in the recommendation that we face
Yeah,
with.
and Professor, I don't want you to rush that aspect of the bill that is putting so much powers in the hands of the minister and not in technical people. What are some of the consequences that could occur with so much power in the hands of the minister instead of technical people wielding some of that power?
Clearly, the most obvious danger is that political decision making will trump at all times, and I'm saying it not to be against Trump, will trump professional decisions. And that has always been the risk that we run. That is why, and the worst thing that can happen is to have a minister who may feel he knows, because there's nothing more dangerous than an ignore. Evidence everywhere has shown me that the people to fear most are those who think they know. They're not humble or show any signs of humility or knowledge, and want to arrogate to themselves the decision-making process. So you have to choose your ministers with great care so that he does not feel, because somebody has a better idea, that somehow he is inferior. Because his responsibility is for ideas to flow. His responsibility is for competence to rise to the top, not he to rise to the top. But then the secure minister in holding such enormous powers runs real risk for any country.
Mm-hmm.
Any country. So it's not a criticism just of Guyana, but a universal criticism.
A universal criticism, but certainly in a place like Guyana, where trust in the government is so low, it compounds the problem for us.
Yeah.
Here. Professor, let's talk a little bit about the auction and some of the discourses that have been in the public domain coming out of the emancipation observances. Is there such a thing as set aside? Because you did say that although the auctions is the method, the auction is the method that the government is using, the government can use other methods in order to grant license. Is there such a thing as setting aside some of the blocks for particular groups in a society?
I feel that my personal feeling on this matter is that any representative government should be allowed to make their choice about allowing the distribution of the resources of the country to reflect comparative need and comparative disabilities or disadvantages groups suffer. any representative government should have that right. My fear is that if the government is not representative, it ends up as being distribution in favor of those whom they favor. That's the danger of it. So, in moving towards allowing the government to select social groups, except for the poor, and even with them to do it in a non-racial way, in a country like Ghana, will raise serious issues of racial contention. Because whether you like it or not, many people feel that the oil sector is something that the Indian Guyanese population are likely to be the inheritors of. And by no, other than the Exxons and so forth, and Chevrons, and not any Afro-Guyanese. That's a very strong feeling. In fact, many Guyanese, when we were at Saro, were hostile to us because they feel that Saro's introducing too many restrictive arrangements in evaluating the need for African Guyanese to get into the oil sector. So regulating that is going to be a tricky operation and very socially sensitive, I think, in a country like Ghana. But I believe that the government, once its representative, should have the responsibility of devising mechanisms to make that possible. And there can be ways in which you can do that. Because if there's an obvious disadvantage in the community, and the shakedown is always one in which only a certain class or sector or segment of society or racial category is losing out, you have to put remedial measures into place. And that is why most people feel that in a country like ours, we need to have evaluations done after the fact, not only before technical feasibility studies, but assessments of the impact, assessments of the policy decisions that we take and implement to ensure that they are spread evenly and in a way that is compatible with social justice across the community as a whole. So the remedy will come at the end rather than the beginning. And you have to be able to establish by objective data, by the conduct of post-event impact assessments of these measures, that you are not acting in a discriminatory way. Governments should come to expect that that is part of their duty as a government and put those mechanisms in place. That is my way in trying to solve that very tricky problem. That's what I recommend. I mean, many people may have other different ideas, but I think that's the best way to proceed.
But you started your
yes. The proof of the pudding is in the eating.
Is in the eating. Professor, you started your answer by putting the burden on a representative government.
Yeah.
And of course, in a society like ours, in a country like ours that is plural, ethnically plural, a representative government takes on a particular meaning, takes on a particular outlook. And we heard recently a reintroduction of the notion of a power sharing / shared governance form of government coming from advocates in the African Guyanese community and quickly being slammed down by the Attorney General, ostensibly, I think, representing the view of the government. Reflect a little bit on this question of a representative government and a robust and democratically run oil and gas industry. Reflect on the relationship between
my view has always been that in a racially separated country like Ghana, given the level of divisions that I know exist, it is absolutely necessary for any resolution of that impasse in the social structure for there to be national governments. That's my first belief. I'm convinced that you cannot have single-party governments or even coalitions which do not reflect the major categories of the racial divide. That's my firm conviction. And it's not because the African Guyanese are in the minority and in the opposition now. It has been the feeling that I think engaged my participation in the WPA when they agreed to join in a coalition government within the APNU. The vision that we tried to introduce in it was always outward. It was always looking for wider incorporation. And this has to be, to my mind, the only solution there is. Everything else is a mirage. It will last as long as they can hold on to power, whichever group it is. And the more and more restrictive and undemocratic the means of response to holding on to this power, the more dangerous it is for the society as a whole. And therefore, I think the creative solution is always the source for the foundations of a unified government in Guyana.
Professor Clive Thomas, they're reflecting historic WPA's position that no one ethnic group can develop our society, and this position was taken long before we ever dreamt of moving towards a petro state. That given the ethnically plural nature of our society, it is imperative that our government and our governance structures reflect that plurality. There can be no development, real development in the society outside of that consensus.
Sustained development as well.
Sustained development. Professor, as usual, is there anything that I didn't ask you that you really want to?
I said them out full today, David. I hope I don't get into any trouble.
No, not at all. This, I think this is a very timely program, and we were able to touch on a lot of issues today. So, Professor, again, thank you very much for coming through.
Thank you for inviting me.
And of course, we ended on that note of a national government as an imperative. We in the Working People's Alliance, we are strong on a couple of things. One, we are strong on the distributive aspect of our newfound resources, oil resources. We feel that it must be done in a non-racial way. And by non-racial, we don't mean a colorblind way. We mean a racially equitable way. And that is why the Buxton proposal arises from our thought process, that we need to find a way to distribute these resources that no ethnic group can look across at the other group and feel that it is disproportionately given preferences. The Buxton proposal is grounded in that non-racial way of distributing our resources. And again, we're making a distinction between non-racial and colorblind. Our non-racialism is not a colorblind. It really arises out of our consciousness that ethnicity and race are important factors, important variables in our politics and our economics. We also feel very strongly that we need a stable society in the era of oil. And that's political stability has to be grounded in a form of governance that does not exclude any sector of the society, does not exclude the representatives of the society. That is why we feel that there could have been more consultation on the bill that was just passed. However, it's water under the bridge, but we feel that one of the lessons we can learn going forward is that the more consultation with the representatives of the people, the electoral represent, but also the non-electoral representatives of people, because we live in the kind of society that representation is not and ought not to be confined just to those who are elected. That civil society in our context becomes even more important because there is that space outside of the government in which people can mobilize ideas to bring to bear on the political process. And so the WPA feels that that was one of the shortcomings. As Professor Clive Thomas so eloquently says, we in the WPA, we feel that putting all of that power in the hands of a minister is really a continuation of the authoritarian instinct that has informed the governance in our post-colonial society. In that regard, we feel that the colonial regime has remained in place. And this era of oil and gas, it is opportune for us to pivot away towards a more democratic society, a more substantively democratic society, because we in the WPA believe in democratic procedures, but we feel that those democratic procedures are incomplete in creating the kind of democratic environment that we need. And so therefore we talk about a substantive democracy to go along with the democratic procedure. And we feel that giving all that power in an industry that is so pivotal to our development is really a miscarriage of justice. We urge that the government remain open to a further amendment of the bill to reduce the powers that are given to the minister. It is a worrying sign. As Professor Thomas has written, that there are lessons that we can learn from other petro states. And we are of the view in the WPA that our government is being hard ears, that it is not learning those lessons. And so the criticism by Professor Thomas, which reflects the WPA's view, that this government has not been consistent with the framework of sustainable development outlined by the United Nations and to which the government is a signatory, a subscriber. We feel that the government has to be more serious in meeting the demands and the outcomes, the objectives, of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. That is a big hole in the government's approach. We in the WPA feel that we have to oppose the government where it is going wrong, but we have to point out to the government where it can go right. We do believe that we ought not to play party politics with our oil and gas. This is our future. This is our time to overcome some of the hurdles that has followed us from slavery and colonialism. And so we feel this is not a partisan issue. We are very strongly opposed to the monopolization of decision-making as far as the oil and gas industry is concerned by this government and any other government. The more we democratize the management of our oil and gas industry, the more we are going to be able to democratize our politics, democratize our governance. And that is why we feel that Minister Nandalal's swift response to Nigel Hughes's raising of power sharing again is not a good sign. It is not a good sign. Any government in an ethnically divided society that represents just half of the electorate, that so quickly dismisses any suggestion about broadening decision-making is up to no good. Is up to no good. And so we urge that Our society takes note of the PPP's continued stubbornness whenever they are in power, their stubbornness towards broadening the base of governance, and to argue that those of us who have consistently for 50 and 60 years argued for power sharing and shared governance, that somewhere or the other we want power through the back door. Arguing for power sharing is not arguing for power through the back door. It's really arguing for power through the front door, because we are saying that in our society, all the indicators point in that direction. The PPP believed that at a certain point. They believed it when they were out of power. And we think that they are playing games. And as we say in the WPA, we can't play games with our future. It was never correct to do so, and it is even more incorrect to do so today. On behalf of Professor Thomas and myself and the Working People's Alliance, we want to thank you all for tuning in to another edition of the Open Word, our podcast, the Politics 101 podcast. And as usual, we love you all. We feel that involvement of people in public discourse is a form of democratizing this society. And we will continue to use this medium and other media to push for a more democratic practice and more democratic outcomes in the society. See you all tomorrow.
One race from the same place that make the same trip on the same ship. So we must push one common intention. It's for a better life in the